President Trump has made conflicting statements about whether the first comprehensive overhaul of our nation's tax policies in 31 years generally helps his wealthy friends or hurts them. In a speech in St. Charles, MO, on November 29 before the tax bill had been finalized, Mr. Trump said about the proposed changes, "I have some very wealthy friends. Not so happy with me, but that's okay." But then at Mar-a-Lago, on December 24, 2 days after he signed the tax bill into law, he told his rich friends at his Palm Beach resort, "You all just got a lot richer." But for at least one group of Mr. Trump's rich friends, private equity moguls, the new tax law has thrown some unexpected curveballs into their business models. The overhaul could force private equity firms to change the way they do deals for the first time since the industry got revved up in the 1980s. The changes are by no means a death knell for private equity. Far from it. But they could seriously disrupt the way potential buyout targets are valued and how quickly private equity magnates can reap their rewards. And there is no question that some of the leverage will come out of leveraged buyouts. What is especially surprising about the changes is that they happened at all, considering the many pictures of private equity executives cozying up to Mr. Trump in the past year or so. Indeed, on December 7, just hours after the Senate had passed its version of the tax bill, Mr. Trump held a $100,000 plate fundraiser at the 740 Park Avenue home of Stephen A. Schwartzman, the co-founder and chief executive of the Blackstone Group, the nation's largest private equity firm. Private equity has thrived for 30 years largely because the tax code allowed interest expense on debt to be deducted from pre-tax income. In other words, the amount of taxable income a business had in any given year could be reduced by the amount of interest expense the company paid to its creditors. That is why private equity deals used to be known as leveraged buyouts. The tax code favored the use of debt, and lots of it, over equity by making the interest paid on the debt tax deductible. So if buyout moguls wanted to maximize the return to equity holders, the tax code gave them a huge incentive to use as much debt as possible. The new law changes that calculus. Whereas there used to be no limit on the amount of interest that could be deducted, from now on, a company can only deduct interest expense equal to 30% of its EBITDA, or earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. In 2022, the limit on tax deductibility of interest tightens further to 30% of EBIT, after depreciation and amortization are deducted. According to the Congressional Joint Committee on Taxation, the first phase of the limit will raise $171 billion over 10 years, while the limit that begins in 2022 is estimated to raise $307 billion over the next 10 years. It's worth noting that the real estate industry somehow got itself exempted from these changes. All things being equal, the change in interest deductibility could affect how much buyout practitioners are willing to pay for companies. The cost of capital will now be higher, which in turn will affect the value of the company or business for sale. What's more, with the corporate tax rate lowered to 21% from 35%, the present value of the tax savings provided by the interest deduction will be less, too. This is not good news for sellers. By some measures, the prices paid by private equity firms to sellers were at a record high in 2017, as was the level of debt used to finance those deals, according to LeveragedLoan.com. Given that the changes to interest deductibility will, in effect, increase the cost of borrowing for leveraged buyouts, it's almost inevitable that prices paid to sellers will come down. Where Congress's sudden aversion to debt came from is not clear, but it also extended to mortgage interest. Thanks to the new law, homeowners are now only able to deduct interest on mortgages up to $750,000. The marginal interest paid on a larger mortgage will no longer be deductible. There are other changes as well that will affect the buyout business. Whereas in previous years, private equity partnerships could get lower long-term capital gains tax treatment after owning a company for only 1 year, the new tax law requires that buyout firms hold their companies for 3 years before getting the lower capital gains tax treatment. That shouldn't be too onerous. It's fair to say that most buyout firms do end up owning their companies for at least 3 years. It could hurt hedge funds, though, which generally prefer shorter holding periods. The good news for buyout moguls is that Congress left alone their cherished loophole on carried interest, the percentage of an investment's gains that a private equity partner takes as compensation. The provision allows that income to be taxed at the lower capital gains rates rather than at ordinary income rates. It's that tax that favors capital over labor and that allows, say, Warren Buffett to pay a lower tax rate than his executive assistant does. The only change to the carried interest treatment for buyout firms under the new tax law is that companies have to be owned for 3 years instead of 1. The private equity industry, especially the bigger firms that like to use lots of leverage to goose their equity returns, cannot be happy about these changes to the tax code. Some analysts have taken note. This change to the tax code will take a bite out of the bottom line of heavily leveraged Main Street companies owned by private equity firms and will reduce the incentives of these firms to overload the companies in their portfolios with debt, observed Eileen Applebaum, a senior economist at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. This is a curious development considering the lobbying effort to defeat this provision and the large number of PE big shots in positions of influence in the Trump administration. But the industry's lobbying arm is doing its best to put a good spin on the unexpected changes. In a statement, Mike Summers, the president and chief executive of the American Investment Council, wrote me that it commends Congress for its pro-growth, comprehensive tax law. Tax reform is challenging, and this new law requires some trade-offs from all sectors of the business community, including private equity. While we advocated against changes to the tax treatment of carried interest capital gains, we feel the 3-year holding period will continue to support long-term investment. The new limitations to interest deductibility will impact all industries that need debt to help finance growth, but we are encouraged that the provision remains a part of the tax code. There will be unintended consequences of the new tax, that's for sure, only time will tell how severe they will be.